The sand along Venice Beach in the early afternoon carries a specific quality of light that photographers chase and never quite capture. Not bright exactly, more like everything is slightly overexposed, the colors washed, just past their natural saturation, the water, a shade of blue, that looks artificial, even when you're standing in front of it. It's the kind of afternoon that draws people out of their apartments and onto the boardwalk, for no particular reason except that staying inside feels like a waste of something. And the crowd that materializes on days like this is the specific Venice crowd, performers, and regulars, and tourists trying to understand what they're looking at. The man who drew the most attention that particular Wednesday was not hard to find. He was never hard to find. His name was Gordon Webb, and he was 32 years old, and he weighed 370 pounds, and he wore that weight the way certain men wear size, not as a burden, but as a statement, as a fact about the world, that the world had better accommodate. He had been a longshoreman, briefly a bouncer, briefly an amateur strongman competitor, who stopped competing, not because he lost, but because winning stopped being interesting once it became predictable. He had a presence that preceded him into spaces, the specific presence that comes from taking up more physical room than most people can comfortably account for, and he had been using that presence as a primary tool since he was 17 years old and first understood what it could accomplish. Gordon sat on the low concrete wall near the boardwalk, eating something from a paper wrapper, watching the beach the way a man watches something that belongs to him without paperwork. This was where he came on his days off. He knew the regular faces. He knew which vendors left him alone and which ones tried to be friendly. He had a radius around him on that wall, an invisible distance that the people walking past maintained without knowing they were maintaining it, the automatic adjustment the body makes around something that reads as large and unpredictable. He noticed the man training near the waterline the same way he noticed most things, slowly, with the confidence of someone who has all the time available that he needs. The man training was small. That was the first thing Gordon registered. Not as information exactly, more as a category. Small, lean, moving through what looked like a series of exercises that had a different quality from what you usually saw people doing at the beach. Not casual, not performed for anyone watching, contained. Each movement finished before the next one started, a chain of separate, precise things rather than one continuous flow, though something underneath all of them connected them in a way Gordon couldn't name, but could feel even from this distance. He watched for maybe a minute. Then he finished what he was eating, crumpled the wrapper, and walked down toward the waterline. His feet left deep prints in the wet sand. The people between him and the waterline created small spaces for themselves without anyone asking them to. He stopped about 12 feet from the training man and watched for another 30 seconds. The training man didn't acknowledge him. He finished a sequence, let his hands settle, and turned around. He was maybe 5'7", 140 pounds if Gordon was being generous. He had the build of someone who had been working very specific muscles for a very long time, lean in a way that didn't photograph as impressive, the kind of physical development that doesn't show off, it just functions. His eyes were level, his breathing was even. He looked at Gordon with the specific quality of attention that belongs to someone who has already assessed a situation and is waiting to see which direction it develops. "What are you doing?" Gordon asked, not hostile, genuinely curious, in the way large men are sometimes genuinely curious about things they could simply end if they chose to. "Training," the smaller man said. His English carried something behind it. Hong Kong mostly. Precise in the way people are precise when a language is something they built rather than inherited. "What kind of training?" "The kind that works," the man said. Gordon smiled. He had a smile that took up significant real estate on his face. "You know what you look like out here?" "Tell me," the man said, and there was something in how he said it, not quite amusement, not quite patience, something between the two that was its own thing. "Like a skeleton decided to take up dancing," Gordon said. "No offense, I'm just saying, you're out here moving around like you know something, but there's nothing on you. What are you going to do with that? That little routine, when something real comes at you?" The smaller man looked at him for a moment. "What kind of something real were you thinking about?" Gordon spread his arms, a gesture that took in his own considerable width, an answer that didn't need words. The smaller man nodded, not the nod of someone agreeing, the nod of someone receiving information they already had. "You've used that," he said. "The size, more than once." "Every time I needed to," Gordon said, "every single time. And it worked." "Every single time," Gordon said again. "I believe that," the smaller man said. And he said it the way people say things when they mean something slightly different from the literal words. The way you say, "I believe the rain is coming," when you can already feel the pressure in the air. Gordon's smile didn't disappear, but it changed quality slightly. the way smiles change when they're no longer entirely about what prompted them. He stepped forward. One step. The specific step of a man who has done this before in other places and has learned that one step is usually all that's required. The smaller man didn't step back. That was the first thing. He didn't step back, didn't adjust his weight, didn't create any distance between himself and the thing that had just moved closer to him. He stood exactly where he had been standing, and he looked at Gordon with that same level, unhurried attention. "Last chance to go back to your wall," the smaller man said. "You know my wall," Gordon said. "I've been watching you sit on it for the last 20 minutes, the smaller man said. "Before you came down here." Gordon looked at him. The smile was fully gone now, not replaced by anger, by something more careful. "You're not what you look like," he said slowly. "Nobody is," the smaller man said. His name was Bruce Lee. He was in Los Angeles for meetings about the project he'd been developing, meetings that had gone into the previous evening and left him needing the kind of morning that only certain beaches at certain hours can provide. He had been training at the waterline for close to an hour before Gordon Webb walked down from the concrete wall. He had watched Gordon on the wall, the same way Gordon had watched him training, with the calm, comprehensive attention he brought to everything, not because he anticipated what would happen, but because watching was simply what he did with his eyes when there was something worth watching. Gordon reached out. Both hands, moving toward Bruce's shoulders, the clinch that had resolved things in bars and parking lots and on other beaches and in half a dozen other situations across the years, the thing that turned the weight differential from an abstraction into a physical fact that the other person had to contend with immediately. 5 seconds, timed later by 3 separate people who were close enough to watch it and who compared their counts because none of them trusted their own memory of it entirely. Gordon's hands reached for shoulders that weren't where his hands expected them. Bruce moved at an angle, not backward, sideways and slightly forward, the specific direction that a person doesn't expect a smaller person to choose, because it meant moving toward rather than away from 370 pounds of committed forward momentum. Gordon's hands closed on air. His forward momentum, which was already committed, continued forward into the space where Bruce had been, and his right foot, which was on wet sand at the edge of the tide line, found less traction than it expected. Bruce's left hand made contact with the inside of Gordon's right forearm, not a block, not a strike, a touch, brief and precise, timed to the exact moment when Gordon's weight was fully committed forward and his foot was making its uncertain relationship with the wet sand. The touch added nothing to Gordon's momentum except a small but specific directional component downward, redirecting the forward force into the ground at an angle that Gordon's feet could not correct for, before the correction became irrelevant. Gordon's right knee bent in a direction it was not designed to support gracefully, under 370 pounds of committed forward motion. His left foot tried to compensate and found the same wet sand. His center of gravity, which sits high in men built like Gordon and takes a long time to correct once it starts moving in the wrong direction, committed fully to the fall before his body could negotiate otherwise. Bruce's right hand, open palm, found Gordon's shoulder at the exact moment when the fall had already been decided, adding nothing more than an acceleration to an outcome that physics had already written. 370 pounds of man arrived on the wet sand. The sound it made was significant, not loud in any dramatic sense. Dense, the specific sound of a large mass completing an unavoidable transaction with the ground, 5 seconds from Gordon's first reach to that sound. Bruce stood where he was. He hadn't taken a step in any direction. His breathing was the same as it had been before Gordon walked down from the wall. His expression was the expression of someone who has just completed a small task that was always going to take this amount of effort and no more. The people nearby had gone completely quiet. Not the theatrical quiet of a crowd that's been surprised, the quieter quiet of people who watched something happen and haven't yet arrived at the part where they process what they watched. Gordon was on his back in the wet sand, looking up at a sky he hadn't been looking at a moment ago, and his immediate physical experience was the experience of someone who has just met the ground and is taking inventory of how the meeting went. He wasn't hurt. Nothing had struck him, nothing had been wrenched or twisted beyond what the fall itself produced, which was discomfort and the specific confusion of a man whose body has arrived somewhere his mind didn't send it. He put his hands flat in the sand. He pushed himself up. This took a moment and required more effort than standing up usually requires, because the wet sand gave way under his weight and because some part of his coordination was still running the calculation of how he ended up horizontal. He got to his feet. He stood. He looked at Bruce Lee. The water came in and retreated behind Gordon's heels, indifferent to everything. "How?" Gordon said. It wasn't quite a question. It was the word that gets used when a person's working model of how things work has just been tested, and the results didn't match the model. Your weight, Bruce said. It was always your weight. I gave it somewhere it wasn't expecting to go. Gordon looked at his own hands. They were the same hands they'd always been, wide and strong, calloused from years of work. They had never failed to accomplish what he sent them to accomplish. He turned them over, looked at the palms. The sand stuck to them. You could have hit me, Gordon said. Yes, Bruce said. More than once. Several times, Bruce said. You didn't. Bruce looked at him without any performance in the looking. You weren't trying to hurt me, he said. You were trying to make a point. Those are different situations, and they call for different responses. Gordon was quiet for a moment. The water came in again. The crowd around them had not dispersed and had not come closer. They were maintaining exactly the distance they were at when Gordon hit the sand, the specific radius of people who have witnessed something and don't want to disturb whatever is happening in its aftermath. What was the point? Gordon asked. He wasn't being aggressive. He was genuinely asking that I could take someone smaller. You believed that before you walked down here, Bruce said. You didn't come down here to find out if it was true. You came down here to demonstrate it to yourself again. Gordon looked at him. Is there a difference? Testing a belief and performing it are different things, Bruce said. You've been performing yours for so long, you stopped noticing it hadn't actually been tested. The water retreated. Gordon's feet had sunk slightly into the wet sand from his weight. And now, he said, now you've had a piece of information your life hadn't given you yet, Bruce said. What you do with it is your decision. He reached down and picked up the towel he had set in the dry sand above the tide line before he started training. He shook it once, folded it over his arm. He looked at the water for a moment, the flat afternoon water, the light on it. Then he looked back at Gordon. You're strong, Bruce said. Genuinely strong. That's real. What you've built is real. You've just been working with one tool and calling it the whole toolbox. He turned and walked up the beach. Gordon watched him go. He watched him move through the crowd that had gathered, which parted for him the way it had parted for Gordon when he walked down, except the reason was entirely different. He watched until Bruce was indistinguishable from the other people on the boardwalk, just another figure in the afternoon crowd, nothing about him marking him as anything except someone who knew exactly where he was going. Then Gordon looked at the sand where he had been. The impression was still there, filling slowly with water as the tide came in, erasing it from the edges inward. He sat down on the wet sand, not because he needed to, just sat, the way people sometimes need to sit after something that required standing up to process. He sat in the wet sand in his swim shorts with the ocean coming in around him and thought about the 5 seconds, which he couldn't reconstruct in the correct order, no matter how carefully he tried. He understood that this was meaningful, that the inability to hold the sequence in order meant something about the sequence, that whatever had happened had operated below the level where his mind could follow it in real time, which meant it had operated below the level where his usual responses could engage with it, which meant he had been working in a framework this entire time, and the framework had just been quietly stepped around, without any drama attached to the stepping. A woman nearby, a stranger, somebody's wife with a folding chair she'd been sitting in when all of this started, said quietly to nobody in particular, "Who was that man?" Gordon heard it. He thought about the answer for longer than the question seemed to require. Then he said, "I don't know his name." He paused. "I should have asked," he said. He found out 3 days later. A friend of a friend who worked in the film industry mentioned the name the way people mention names that are becoming something, not quite famous yet, but moving toward it, recognizable to people who paid attention to certain things. Gordon received the name and sat with it in his kitchen for a while without asking any follow-up questions. Not because he didn't have them. He had several. He just understood that no answer to any of them would explain the 5 seconds on the wet sand any better than sitting quietly with what he already knew. Some things you understand by watching someone explain them. Some things you understand only by having them demonstrated on you directly, and even then, the understanding comes slowly, in the days after, rather than in the moment. He went back to Venice Beach that Saturday, sat on his usual wall. The beach was the same beach. The crowd moved the same way around him. His radius was intact. But something in how he experienced the radius had changed slightly. He couldn't quite name what. It was something like the difference between a certainty you've tested and a certainty you've only performed, and now that he knew the difference existed, he couldn't stop being aware of it. He didn't go looking for Bruce Lee. He thought about it. He had a general sense of where to look, the name pointed in certain directions. He thought about it for a few weeks, and then decided against it, though he couldn't fully articulate why. The closest he came to explaining it was something he said to a man he knew from the docks, about a month after the beach, when the other man asked why Gordon seemed quieter lately, less apt to fill a room the way he usually filled it. Gordon thought about how to answer this honestly. He said that he'd run into something on the beach a few weeks back that he was still thinking about. The other man asked what happened. Gordon said someone smaller than him had put him on the sand in 5 seconds without hitting him once. The other man waited for the rest of the story. Gordon said, "That's all there was. And that's what you're still thinking about." "I'm thinking about the fact that he could have hit me," Gordon said, "multiple times apparently, and he decided not to. And the reason he decided not to tells you more about the difference between us than the 5 seconds does." The other man considered this. What reason was that? Gordon looked at his coffee. He said, "I wasn't trying to hurt him, that I was just trying to make a point," and he could tell the difference and respond to the actual situation instead of the one he wanted to be happening. He paused. "I've never done that," Gordon said. "I've always responded to the version of a situation that made it make sense to use what I had, which meant I always found a version that worked." He looked up. "But that's not the same as seeing what's actually there." The other man didn't have an answer for this. Neither did Gordon really. It wasn't the kind of thing that resolved into an answer. It resolved into a question that stayed with you and changed how you moved through the next situation and the one after that. A young man named Victor Chen had been on the beach that Wednesday. He was 23 years old, a student who trained at a school in the valley and had come to Venice on his day off for the same reason most people came: the light and the water and the low-grade sense that something interesting might happen. He was sitting near the boardwalk eating a sandwich when Gordon walked down from the wall, and he positioned himself to watch because he recognized Bruce and thought something was likely to unfold. He gave an account of those 5 seconds to several people over the following years, and each time he gave it, he ended on the same detail. Not the fall itself. What happened after. "He picked up his towel," Victor said, "each time. He shook the sand off it. He looked at the water for a moment, like he was just looking at the water, and then he walked away. And the man on the ground watched him go, and the people watching watched him go, and nobody said anything. And I kept waiting for Bruce to do something else, to acknowledge the crowd or say something more to the man, or at least look back once. He didn't look back. He was already somewhere else, in his mind by the time he reached the boardwalk. Like the whole thing had already been filed away, and he was back to whatever he'd been thinking about before he noticed Gordon coming down from the wall." Victor paused in these accounts, always at this point. "I've trained for years," he said. "I've studied serious people, and the thing I've never seen replicated is that. The complete absence of any need for the moment to mean something to the people watching it. He knew what had happened. He didn't need anyone else to know that he knew. There was nothing in him looking to be seen knowing it. He described this to different people in different ways over the years and arrived at different wordings for it, but the essential thing he was trying to communicate stayed the same. That there was a kind of freedom in what he watched Bruce do that had nothing to do with the 5 seconds, and everything to do with what the 5 seconds revealed about the person who had spent however many years building the capacity that produced them. A freedom from the need for witness. A completeness that didn't require the completion of a crowd watching and understanding and responding. Victor ran a small school for many years afterward. He had a rule he enforced consistently with his students about training alone, about developing technique in the absence of observers, about building something that didn't depend on being seen to be real. When students asked where the rule came from, he gave different answers at different times, depending on the student and what he thought would land best. But the real answer, the one he kept for himself, was a Wednesday afternoon in Venice, a 5-second exchange in the wet sand, and a man walking away from it without once looking back to see if anyone was watching him go. That's the complete story, as far as anyone who was there could tell it. A man who had spent years making the world accommodate his size met something that had spent the same years developing a different relationship with size entirely, and the meeting lasted 5 seconds and cost nothing except a version of certainty that Gordon Webb had been carrying for a long time and found, in the days after, that he was not entirely sorry to be carrying slightly less of. The beach was the same beach the next morning. The light was the same light. The water came in and went out with complete indifference to everything that had happened the afternoon before and everything that would happen in every afternoon to follow. That indifference is part of the story too, though it's harder to explain why.